Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. Delighted to be joined as ever in the studio by Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And with us down the line, Spike columnist Rakib Ehsan.
Hello.
So we've got plenty to talk about today. We'll be discussing the Gregg Wallace scandal, the collapse of the French government and Keir Starmer's woes. Before we get on to that, Tom, do you want to tell us or give us an update on the Christmas Give-a-thon?
Yes, so thank you so much to everyone who's donated so far to the Christmas Give-a-thon, that time of year when we ask our readers and listeners and viewers to donate to fund our work as we go into the new year. We've been overwhelmed by the response so far, so thank you so much for that. If you haven't heard about the Give-a-thon yet, all over this month we are campaigning for your donations to help steel us for the year ahead. And we've also got a really special offer on at the moment. People often ask when they view our podcasts, they ask about these mugs, these very handsome white and red mugs that we sipping our drinks out of. How can we get them? How can we buy them? The only way to get your hands on one is to donate to our Christmas Give-a-thon. Anyone who gives £50 or more will get one in the post, provided they live in the UK. So if you want to donate either to get your hands on a mug or just to give whatever you can afford at this time of year, do go to spiked-online.com/donate.
And while you're in the Christmas mood, why not also treat yourself to some of our lovely Beckett's gins from our sponsor? I am going for the slow gin this time. It's absolutely brilliant. It's got a wonderful flavour. You don't need to have anything, any mixtures with it, but they have some really good cocktail ideas as well on the Beckett's Gin website. Tom was just enjoying the spirited gin.
Very nice it is too.
Nice and strong, nice little kick in that.
It's fired me up for the next half an hour.
So to take advantage of their generosity for sponsoring us, you can get 20% off by going to becketsgin.co.uk/spiked. That's BECKETTS gin, GIN.co.uk/spiked, and you can get 20% off. So do check that out. Do buy loads of gin for your stocking fillers this Christmas. It's been about a week. It's been rumbling on the Gregg Wallace scandal. It seems to have eclipsed just about every other news story on earth, international and domestic, all dating back to allegations of inappropriate behaviour by the MasterChef star, mostly on the set of MasterChef and other programmes. He's been accused of some quite serious things, from groping, but much of the commentary has been around things like inappropriate jokes, bawdy humour, that kind of thing. Tom, what have you made of this scandal?
Well, I suppose the first thing that's worth saying is that I've been struck, maybe I shouldn't have been, by how much it has dominated the media discussion. It's not as if there's not things going on in the world at the moment. You were kind of looking at your news feeds and seeing, war again in Syria, attempted coup d'etat in South Korea. And of course, we're still leading with the latest day 12 allegations against Gregg Wallace. It's not to say, as you say, that there isn't a case to answer, that there doesn't have to be some sort of investigation, but the preoccupation with it has been a little bit off. I guess that's a legacy of Me Too, and also the fact that you've got a lot of people in the media who like talking about things in the media, and you've got a BBC that always likes talking about what's going on within the BBC, almost to a fault. But I suppose another concerning thing is, as ever, the lack of a sort of general spirit of due process in these situations. As you say, some of these allegations are very serious. They should be looked into. But the way in which Gregg Wallace, as everyone else who is accused in the public eye these days, they're just presumed guilty and the punishment is meted out almost instantly. Even this kind of bizarre overreaction of taking celebrity MasterChef off the air as a consequence of this, because people can't deal with the image of Gregg Wallace, because there's one Labour MP put it, too many women would find it triggering. I just think there's something about whenever these scandals come up, they can't just say, we're going to look into this and take it seriously. They have to go full Commissar Vanishes and expunge their very vestige from the internet. And I suppose the other thing is just the way in which, again, you have the way in which things are lumped together, I suppose, in these discussions, because there are very clear-cut allegations, which are quite serious, but then it naturally gets conflated with a kind of general climate, humour, comments and so on. But I suppose 'twas ever thus in these kinds of fevered sorts of moments that we seem to have been experiencing periodically over the past 10 years.
Definitely. Rakib, what have you made of it?
Well, I think that in the early stages, it was very much top story. It still continues to be top story across much of mainstream media. What was really interesting, there was one day where you had an ongoing jihadist-led rebel offensive in Syria. You've had the NHS recently suffering cyber attacks, a recent one on a children's hospital in Liverpool. You had Trump threatening to implement 100% tariffs on the BRICS nations. And I think there was also the Sturgis inquiry, which many people weren't even aware about, where it said that the UK government was guilty of abject failure. It heard that the government was guilty of abject failure over the Salisbury poisonings. And what was the top story? It was Gregg Wallace's Instagram stories. And I found that quite remarkable. And I think that kind of trend has continued. Now, of course, much of what he's being accused of, that there are serious allegations there. They deserve to be thoroughly investigated surrounding his behavior on MasterChef, but also Strictly Come Dancing, I believe as well, where he was knocked out of that edition in the very first week. But I think that what it really shows is what the mainstream media tends to be preoccupied with. And we've had, in my view, we've seen this rise of glamour feminism. That's what I call it. And I think that's what Tom touched upon there with the Me Too movement. And I think while you see this, we've had serious scandals connected to group-based child sexual exploitation, grooming gang scandals. There have also been very serious cases of honour-based violence as well in the UK. And I think it's just a shame that so-called feminists in the mainstream media, they'll focus on these kind of cases. I'm not trivializing the importance of this, but they tend to neglect what I'd consider to be nitty-gritty feminism.
And also, I mean, Tom, there does seem to be something a bit amiss at the BBC where these kinds of scandals, they sort of blow up because no one nipped anything in the bud, you know. It just seems like poor management, if nothing else.
They seem to be content to address these things 10 or 15 years down the line when it's turned into a huge scandal rather than right then and there. I mean, obviously their deflection is that this is about the production company. This is a product that was being sold to us. But at least if you take the various people in the media at their word, this was something which was being talked about for a very long time. So once again, just complete a disaster area for them in terms of how they've actually dealt with this, but we've come to expect that, I suppose. It's one of those things where I think we've not really learnt the lessons though of the kind of whole Me Too period, which is the fact that there have been very many situations in which people have been accused of quite serious crimes in some cases or serious misconduct. And of course, the response in all those cases was to just kind of presume guilt and carry on with it. But, you know, in the wake of Kevin Spacey being exonerated on every count that he was ever levelled at, I think we do need to get over this reflex of just assuming guilt based on the weight of the sheer number of allegations and moving kind of instantly towards punishment without really considering the consequences or the potential for injustice that could be produced there. I know Gregg Wallace is a very difficult person to defend in terms of his right to due process, but as Luke Gittos said on the site this week, I think we need to start thinking of that less as a sort of narrow legal principle and one that we should just apply to these allegations full stop. It's not to say that we should rubbish them or ignore them, but surely the part of the story of the last 10 to 15 years is that you can't just jump on the bandwagon instantly because things might not be all they seem. Maybe they are all they seem, but I would just wish people would take a break. And I do think a lot of it is just driven by the fact that it's a media story and the media likes talking about the media. And as a consequence of that, as Rakib was saying, the outsized interest which is taken in essentially workplace inappropriate misconduct, whilst very serious predatory behaviour, patterns of predatory behaviour across the country, scandals that rumble on for years and are never really addressed for all the reasons that we've talked about with something like grooming gangs, again, makes a headline for like a couple of days and then disappears without trace for months and years on end until it flares up again. So it just feels like we need to recalibrate, but we've never seem capable of, I suppose.
This episode of the Spike Podcast is also sponsored by ExpressVPN. Going online without ExpressVPN is like having sex without a condom. A lot of the time, it'll be fine. Until it isn't. And then there are some pretty major repercussions. That's why everyone who uses the internet needs a VPN. Every time you log into an unencrypted network, that's hotels, airports, or even your local cafe, your data is there for the taking. That includes things like credit card details, your email, your social media passwords, and even your passport number and photographs. Online hackers don't care who you are or what you do. They target everyone. That's because your data can fetch up to £1,000 on the dark web. So protect yourself with ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN has watertight security. It would take a hacker with a supercomputer more than 1 billion years to get past ExpressVPN's encryption. And ExpressVPN works on all devices, phones, laptops, and tablets. All you need to do is fire up the app and you're off and running. ExpressVPN is one of the most important tools in my toolbox. As a journalist, I'm always working on the go, and ExpressVPN gives me peace of mind when I'm working on the bus, the tube, or a cafe, or racing to get to my next interview or back to the office. Right now, you can take advantage of ExpressVPN's Black Friday and Cyber Monday offer to get the absolute best VPN deal you'll find all year. Using our special link, expressvpn.com/spiked, you can get an extra 4 months with the 12-month plan or 6 extra months with a 24-month plan, totally for free. So go to expressvpn.com/spiked to get an extra 4 or even an extra 6 months of ExpressVPN for free. That's expressvpn.com/spiked. So the French government has collapsed. The National Assembly it's had a vote of no confidence, ousting the Prime Minister Michel Barnier. Viewers at home will probably remember him best for his role as the lead Brexit negotiator on behalf of the European Union, but he was handpicked by Macron to be Prime Minister to essentially push through these his austerity measures, a new budget, and it's all ended in tears and disaster. Tom, do you think there are some sort of general principles we can draw out of this?
I think it's another body blow, really, to the technocratic supposed centre. I mean, it's really, you can't really overplay, I think, the extent to which Macron really became a kind of totem of the European Brussels-centric establishment. Because when he did come to power in 2017, he was very much seen as almost the repudiation of populism. That, in the wake of the Brexit vote and what a blow to Brussels' moral authority that was. Here we had a centrist technocratic leader who could triumph. I mean, you literally had The Economist portraying him as Jesus Christ, as walking on water. And yet the unspoken reality all the way through was that he's always been incredibly unpopular. He's never been able to command much support amongst the public. His ability to cling on to the presidency has always basically been predicated on the fact that the system, the presidential system, and the way in which it runs down to 2 candidates and the cordon sanitaire, which always meets Marine Le Pen when she is running, means that he's been able to cling on to his particular position. But him as an individual, the program, the austerity program that he wants to push through has never commanded popular support. And it really does demonstrate, I think, that complacency that you had in the wake of 2017 onwards, which was this idea that Brexit and Trump were a blip, that the old order was reasserting itself in a more energetic fashion, that the supposed centre, as they call it, could be saved if you had someone who had enough degrees and enough dynamism and was smart-suited and attractive enough in the form of Macron. And yet his political career will go down one as tremendous failure, which is not only in the process of bringing himself down, but is also calling into question the entire Fifth Republic with, a system which was set up to have an empowered executive and political stability, and you've ended up with a lamed up prime minister and political instability to an enormous degree. So you can't really fail much more than he has.
Yeah.
And what he represents has failed as well, I suppose, as well.
That's absolutely true. And we can't, you couldn't possibly overstate the mess that he has left behind. This is now France is facing the worst political, constitutional and economic crisis that it has in decades, in arguably, yes, in the history of the entire Fifth Republic, in 60 years. The economy is in an absolutely dire state. The price of French borrowing went above that of Greece recently, and we all know what how much trouble Greece has been in recent years. The level of debt has risen to the kind of point where Italy was when it was teetering on the brink of the euro crisis. Now, I'm not saying that France is going to explode anytime soon, or that it's close to that point, but Macron came in and promised to create this new dynamic startup, modern competitive economy, and look where we are. We're in exactly the opposite position. And the same with politics, as you said. The point of Macron was to see off the far right, to see off Marine Le Pen. They have never been so emboldened until at this moment. And for now, there won't be elections, it doesn't seem, but there will be a lot of political paralysis. How is this? The technocrats, the rule followers, the experts have brought us to a point where France is now effectively ungovernable. Rakib, what have you made of the whole situation?
Well, I think that the Fifth Republic is bursting at the seams, to be honest, because of the some of the reasons that you've mentioned there. I think it's remarkable that this is the first time a government's collapsed in France because of a no confidence vote since 1962. And what it really shows is that you have Barnier, who's meant to be this polished, professional technocrat, but he attempted to do something which was deeply authoritarian. He knew that his budget didn't command majority support in the National Assembly, yet he decided to use these special powers to try and force through his 2025 budget, which includes attempting to reduce the deficit to the tune of 60 billion euros. And I think what it really shows is that sometimes technocrats think that they know better than everyone else, that they don't look to attempt to cultivate wide-reaching support for their agenda. And I think that's wholly undemocratic. And I think the point that you fellas have made about President Macron, he was meant to be this, incredibly polished centrist. He would ward off the hard left and hard right threat. Well, it was the hard left and the hard right which had collapsed this government. The New Popular Front and the National Rally effectively joining forces to bring down this government. And I think what it really shows as well is that people in France, but I think in other Western economies as well, they believe that they're living under a broken economic model. And they don't want to be subjected to what will be very punishing forms of austerity, which will lead to all kinds of economic and social and indeed cultural devastation in their local communities. So I think it needs to be a major wake-up call for the Parisian centrist political establishment. And I think that the hard left and the hard right, whatever people think about the New Popular Front and the National Rally within that establishment, they need to be taken more seriously and they need to be treated with a bit more respect.
And as you were just saying there, Rakib, it's not just France. This is a, Europe-wide, Western-wide phenomenon. I mean, it was only a month ago when Germany had to pull the plug on its own coalition. We're expecting elections possibly in the new year. Of course, even more famously, Donald Trump smashing the Democrats. It seems like the sort of technocratic center is being, it's toppling wherever we look.
No, absolutely. And I think they're starting to wake up to that. I think we were talking recently about the very different tone that a lot of the postmortems of, say, Trump's recent re-election, whereas previously there was an attempt to basically just stick the proverbial fingers in the air and pretend that it's not happening, to say it could be explained away by some kind of glitch or some kind of foul play. I think it's slowly dawning on various Western technocratic leaders that their authority has been so incredibly called into question. One thing I would add, though, I suppose, is that the elephant in the room in this whole discussion is the European Union itself. Is the way in which it binds nation states and their ability to respond, the kinds of policies it effectively demands of particular countries when their economic outlook hits the skids. And that's something which quite strikingly across Europe, a lot of the right populist upstarts have really actually backed away from their Euroscepticism at precisely the time in which nations should be looking to challenge those fetters. It seems like the closer that various populist parties get to power, the more they decide they're going to need to be seen to be playing ball with the European Union, and the sense that they want to almost diffuse that as a particular issue as something that could be thrown at them. And obviously there's the kind of general political realities of the fact that if you're in the Eurozone, this is having some sort of break with Brussels is potentially much more drastic, something which is potentially really going to cause tremendous economic instability in the short term. But I think slowly but surely people have to recognise that a situation in which you are a member state rather than a nation state, a situation in which you have to get your budgets rubber stamped by faceless technocrats, is really creaking under the weight of its own contradictions and lack of democratic legitimacy. But it's striking that many of the right populist parties, certainly, but some of the left populist parties over recent years as well, who've had success, they seem to be unwilling to even think about grasping that nettle of a genuine break with Brussels.
So Keir Starmer has done a bit of a reset this week. The day we're speaking, he unveiled his 6 new milestones as part of a plan for change. Now, we shouldn't confuse the milestones with the 5 missions or the 6 missions. I think there's milestones, missions, and what's the other one?
There was the 6 first steps.
The first steps, of
which
course.
were announced before the election, I think.
Yeah.
And now we've got the 6 milestones. And when someone asked him why immigration wasn't a milestone, he said, no, that's a foundation. Which is what the pledges and the steps and everything else.
And there's a
sit on
nice
top of.
little arrow flow chart doing the rounds on X to sort of explain the the thinking behind it, the milestones and the foundations. And Rakib, what this suggests to me is that actually, the Labour government, on the one hand, recognises that it needs a bit of a reset because it's floundering in terms of both, public popularity, not getting its programme through, but also they have no sense of, how the public thinks about things. It is very cold and technocratic.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think it felt almost like a manifesto launch. And I think that it's very clear that the Labour government seriously struggled. It hasn't hit the ground running at all. And I think this is a desperate attempt to try and get the government back on track, even though it's a very early stage in terms of Labour returning to power. I think that the actual milestones planned for change, whatever you call it, on the surface, there's some decent ideas in there. I think there needs to be a restoration of neighbourhood policing. The target to build 1.5 million homes is quite ambitious. They're talking about raising living standards in every part of the UK. There's also this talk about making sure we have 95% clean power provision by 2030. So that there are some, I could say, there's some understandable objectives which have been stated. But as you say, ultimately, I think immigration was a glaring omission. We had the ONS immigration figures come out last week, which said that for the year ending June 2023, net migration was 906,000. And for the year ending June 2024, the provisional estimate in terms of the number of migrants entering the UK is 1.2 million. So I just think that says that immigration is a foundation. I think that Labour missed a trick there, because I think this is actually where the Conservatives are quite soft. The Conservatives, when they're in government, there's a huge gap between the rhetoric and the reality when it came to immigration. And I think that actually if you had immigration as the first objective, then everything else may well flow from that. Because I think without tackling immigration, I don't think you can truly make headway when it comes to some of those objectives.
But there are also objectives that are contradictory, because, the top objective is to increase household income, but then that conflicts quite heavily with the decarbonisation plan, you would think.
No, it's interesting as well, as many people have pointed out, they've rolled back that decarbonisation of the grid by 2030 by 5%. So now it's going to be 95%, which maybe that's the direction of travel. And, we should appreciate the baby steps. But as you say, it's a complete contradiction. And I think it's just added to a sense that had already set out in the country, which is that whilst people were kind of, willing to sort of not enthusiastically support Labour, but to kind of give in and let it run the country for a while on a pretty meagre
Could
actual
they be
mandate.
Worse than the last lot?
And I think they've realised that they really can. There was often a lot of talk about, is Keir Starmer going to be the new Tony Blair? Is Keir Starmer going to be more like Kinnock, a kind of transitional figure? Keir Starmer has turned out to be the new Rishi Sunak. He has more resets than a knackered version of Windows 95. He is constantly having to try and communicate these very technocratic principles and thinking, these very technocratic targets, I should say, and thinking that is the same as having a political outlook and a political programme. And he's also engaging in what various middle-of-the-road Tories have been doing over recent years, is continuing to govern in precisely the same way as they've done previously, but just occasionally in a speech saying things that might get the Telegraph leaders column excited, whether it was denouncing the open borders experiment, as he put it, of the last government, or whether it's talking about taking on the NIMBYs and, expressing his dismay at the fact that, HS2 was having to pay 100 million to protect some bats. And it's one of those things where no one really buys it, though. Yeah. Certainly the right centre commentariat aren't buying it, but also the public, I think, have just feel that sense of drift. And I think it's no surprise that Labour's poll rating is absolutely plunging. There was one out today which actually put them third behind Reform, and Tories at the top, of course. And his own personal ratings have been completely eviscerated. But everyone could see this coming. There was not only was there no enthusiasm for him, there was also no clear sense that he had a clear-eyed view, a programme, and the nous to create the kind of measurable change that he wants, that he thinks is his way out of the polling hole that they found themselves in.
And it's interesting. I mean, even, the comparison to Sunak, I mean, as awful as Sunak was, Starmer's pledges are really hard to remember. They're not things that, stick in your head. If you remember, what did Sunak say? Stop the boats.
Of course, we all know
halve inflation. I mean, these things didn't work out, but
at least inflation did halve. But that's
inflation, that was the only one. But that wasn't
knew it was going to happen anyway.
There's nothing to do with him in particular. But it at least you thought, I understand what that pledge is. Whereas, one of them is, get 90 or 75% of children school ready by the end of term. These things are not the issues that are necessarily on the top of people's lips. They're not expressed in ways that are in any way relatable to people. It just shows that even their best attempt at relating to people at resetting has been completely botched. Rakib, anything else you want to add on Starmer?
No. I think you make a fantastic point. I think another one of the pledges is that 92% of patients, they shouldn't be waiting any more than 18 weeks or so when it comes to treatment. That's the sort of NHS aspiration. I think the one you're referring to there is that 75% of 5-year-olds should be ready to learn once they reach that age. And I think it really taps into that point that these sound very technocratic objectives. They're not going to stick in the average voter's mind. As one example would be, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, affordable homes for all young families, just something like that. Because and I think that the worry is that it's such a technocratic approach. It shows that Keir Starmer, and I suspect much of the cabinet, they don't have a real philosophical grounding in their politics. And I don't think that they certainly lack a vision for the country in terms of how do they genuinely want to improve it. I actually think that the problem here is that even though some of these objectives they come across as entirely reasonable, there's very strict targets attached to them. So while it allows Starmer to say, "Oh, look, I've definitely achieved this," if he does. If he doesn't, then everyone's going to be able to see it, which is why I think just from a sort of a politically strategic perspective, I suspect that if you leave it more open-ended, more sort of vision style mission setting, then that might have actually served him better on this occasion.
The lack of philosophy is so glaring. It seems as if, he's been in power for well, actually not that long, but a couple of months now. You'd think you'd have a sense of who he is, what he believes in. I feel like the only thing we know still is that he believes in international law and assisted dying. Those seems to be the only two principles.
Absolutely. Two actual consistent positions of his, whereas everything has just come and gone depending on what the headlines were and who it was that what particular constituency he felt he had to address at any one time. And he's being found out. I mean, we've a lot of this conversation has been the way in which the technocratic supposed centre has failed so catastrophically. But in Keir Starmer, you have a figure who is not only very much of that establishment politics, the very settlement which has completely failed, particularly working class people, but the sort of politics which is enraging vast swathes of the electorate. He is very much a kind of embodiment of that. But at the same time, he's just a pathetic figure at the same time and incredibly inept as much as he is authoritarian and all the rest of it. So it does feel like he's going to be the next skittle to fall. I mean, when that happens, we'll see. But the idea that was touted around by some of the more excitable Labour commentators at the last election result, the idea that was any kind of shot in the arm for whatever it is that Keir Starmer is surely lies in tatters now. And it really hasn't been that long. So how quickly he's been found out has been pretty stunning, I think.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.